Good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Karen Abrams, and I'm the Executive Director of Survivors Rising. We're an Omaha-based nonprofit that is dedicated to uplifting and amplifying the voices of post-crisis survivors. And we define post-crisis as any time after somebody has left an abusive or traumatic situation. And we define survivors as anybody who has survived domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, harassment, stalking, human trafficking, and any other related issues. So welcome everybody to tonight's workshop, Parenting Through Trauma. I'd like to introduce our facilitator, our board member, Jamise Williams, and she will go ahead and introduce our fabulous panel. See you again later. Enjoy. Bye.
Thank you. So again, I'm Jamise Williams. I am currently the Street Outreach Supervisor at Youth Emergency Services, and also, as Karen said, a board member with Survivors Rising. We have Brea Worthington, who I've known for several years. She is a board member of MORE and also the CEO and founder of Lyfe Changes. And we also have JaQuala. And JaQuala, can you remind me your last name, please? I apologize. JaQuala, I'm sorry, JaQuala. Yep.
Yarbro.
Yes. And Cherie Mitchell. And they will be part of our panel. So we will go ahead and start with these questions. Okay. So again, this is Parenting Through Trauma. And any one of you all can start this with the panel. When we talk about trauma for survivors, especially those who are parenting, what does that mean and what does that include?
I would just echo that and say ditto. I would, if I could sum it up, I would say that it is parenting while yet still trying to manage symptoms of horrific experiences that have left a mark on you that you have to work through. So,
does trauma mean anything unique for Black women survivors? And what would that look like?
I think that, and like I said, coming from the mental health perspective, trauma is unique for Black women survivors in that, there's several different factors there. Racism being one of them. Unfortunately, that is something that as African-American women, we do have to face when we look for providers and we're looking for treatment is the racism that does exist. Although lots of awareness has been brought about in terms of discrimination and racism in mental health. However, there's still lots of struggle and discrepancies there that Black women have to, that Black women face as a challenge when it comes to mental health and trauma. So definitely racism is one. And another one I would say is religious beliefs. A lot of times we, in the Black community, we use prayer to handle stress, and we rely on family and, church and community. But a lot of times, if, that can be a barrier to treatment if, they're unaware of, what I'm saying, the real need that the woman need, that the woman has and everything like that. So a lot of times while, community, family, and spirituality can be a support, it can serve as a barrier at the same time. And I do think that that is something that is unique to, to Black women.
I echo what Cherie said. I kind of look at it as we have generational curses and beliefs. And with women of color, we have the generational trauma from slavery, from maybe immigration, things like that, where you're kind of your family is kind of separated immediately. So the first trauma that we have may have been passed through. We may not have, it is considered secondary trauma, where it may not have necessarily happened to us directly, but indirectly, what has happened to our families in the past has affected the way our parents parented us. So sometimes that is traumatizing. And then when you look at the parenting beliefs, especially for African Americans. A lot of times when you're parenting through trauma, I know a lot of African American women struggle with the perception on if they're parenting properly. Historically, it always seems like African American women mothers want to always be right, or they have to win. So one of the things that we've struggled when you're parenting through trauma is learning that you're an individual and that your experience is yours, and the fear of being judged with your parenting could really affect it. So yes, your color does have a lot of weight in your history when it comes to parenting through trauma.
I would add, just to speak to the historical component of trauma for Black women specifically, Black people are descendants of Africans who primarily function in a circular model tradition. And as they were brought into European society was more of a bureaucracy where women were on the bottom. And so then to add to that, where Africans fit in, and now Black people, the descendants of Africans, fit into that, women are on the bottom of that hierarchy. And so a Black woman traditionally never had a voice. She was expected to, she didn't have feelings. She was expected to be able to, bear children, work under harsh conditions, have a baby and go back into the field, have a baby perhaps in the field and continue to work. And so a lot of those stereotypes have continued to, cast a shadow over how Black women are treated, how trauma is perceived with Black women. And so our problems, even, whether it's in the judicial system or the education system, any system that we engage that has its roots in European society, generally is not sensitive to the trauma that Black women experience.
So Jessica wrote in the chat, trauma can be cumulative, and Black women face the challenge of accumulating more pain from continuous adversity and racism. Trauma is unique to the individual, but is largely unavoidable for Black women who have to continuously fight oppression. And so listening to the conversations and what you guys said, that goes back to that old cliche of the strong Black woman and having to be a strong Black woman. How does that continue to affect the parenting through the trauma, but also what suggestions or what ways can you suggest to Black women survivors specifically for the racism piece and how they parenting and how they can, how that cliche of being a strong Black woman doesn't have to necessarily paint the picture of how you are as a parent?
I'll jump in. From the parent coach standpoint, I think one of the harder things to understand, especially if you're a survivor of domestic violence or a similar experience like that, is understanding your children have age appropriate behavior, and you are entitled to have your own personal experiences. But you have to separate your experience and your trauma from parenting, because children are like a blank slate. Like, you don't expect someone to go in on the first day of the job and know everything, or you don't expect a student to come into the classroom and know everything. Children are the same way. So if you're parenting through trauma, and unfortunately, if your abuser or the person that traumatized you is someone that you share a child with, you have to be mindful that this child is 50% yours, 50% theirs. So you have to be very sensitive on how you're forming that young mind. And each child develops differently when it comes to respond differently to when it comes to trauma, because one child might be overly sympathetic and one child may be indifferent. So keeping in mind, especially for African American women, one of the things that I've ran into when I've done parent coaching is that's not how I was raised, or you just beat them. Now, while a lot of people don't agree with spanking, but I always go back to making people go back and putting themselves in those shoes when that happened to them as a child. Now, was it effective or was it not effective? Because unfortunately, each child and the same methods are not going to work for any child, because they all have different personalities. So from a parent coach standpoint, I think understanding behaviors, understanding that it is okay to be human, it's okay to feel. You have to also understand that depending on the age of your child, they may not be very understanding of your trauma, and they may be very insensitive to certain things.
And I think also is that, for the woman to first even recognize that it is trauma, I think what happens a lot of times is that, it's just viewed as life. A lot of times we see, our parents struggle with things, grandparents and everything like that, to where it's not even viewed as traumatic until it's kind of brought to their attention and to that awareness that like this is not normal and this is not okay. I've sat across the office with with lots of Black women, various ages, who never sought mental health treatment before, for the first time, sit and realize that like, wow, that was traumatic. My childhood, I did experience trauma. And a lot of times, the things that they're suffering is from definitely PTSD, that they have no idea that is even, anything that they're experiencing, because to them, it is just life. And so being able to separate and say, you know what, no, this is a traumatic event. This happened. This is not normal. And, and attending to that need, I think is a big part of it, because a lot of times, the things that life throw us, I mean, especially for African American women, who, like I said, like you guys talked about, as far as having that strong Black woman persona, you can take anything and, you can do it, and stuff like that. So just getting them to recognize that it was a traumatic event, I think is a big, step to, the healing process.
What are some of the myths about mental health and therapy that are challenges to survivors seeking help?
I think that as a survivor, and working with other survivors in this work, I think that major barriers are, it is very difficult to trust mental health professionals, because you know that your mental health professional is a mandated reporter. If you start telling an individual the entire truth, as ugly as it can get, you run the risk of someone, giving you some type of negative diagnosis, or a diagnosis that you would view as negative. You run the risk of, individuals recommending that you take medication. You run the risk of perhaps your professional reputation. Boom. Your professional reputation is completely gone. But you also, I think in such a small community, you run the risk of privacy not being respected. And in any mental health realm, the last thing people want is to open up and tell you their deepest, darkest secrets and hurts and what they're really dealing with, right? And then to have someone, discuss that over dinner, or say, hey, that's what happened to so-and-so, And unfortunately, we have HIPAA and, all these other things that are set up that theoretically should maintain privacy. But on a lot of occasions, people defy HIPAA, and, how do you prove it? But that's, for me, that was a big one, was, just finding a provider that would not share my experiences with other people.
And I would agree with JaQuala, because it's not just mistrust with people who don't look like us in the mental health profession. Just as much distrust exists among providers that are African American as well, because it's a small Black community here in Omaha, and we swear somebody knows somebody, and so we don't want anyone in our business. And so that is a really big barrier in seeking treatment. And again, like we talked about, I think religion is another one, and in just believing that you can pray things away. We just need to go to church. We can fast. We can pray. We can tithe. We can, do all of these other things. And so, in that, because what happens in our family stays in our family, and just this, wanting to show this strength as opposed to being weak, as opposed to being perceived as being weak. If we are struggling with depression or anxiety or PTSD, is one of the big myths, is that you're weak if you are struggling mentally. So I think that's another one of the big barriers and myths of mental health in African American women seeking treatment.
When we put the parenting component into the mental health, one of the things that I have learned that has been a large challenge for survivors of domestic violence is the gray area, because there's the thin line between, is this mother able to keep these children safe? If we get rid of the abuser, who may be the father of the children, how are these children ever going to have a relationship with their father? I've found that a lot of the women that I have engaged that were in domestic violence relationships with the father of their children really had a hard time articulating to the mental health professional, how do I co-parent? How do I become, we've created a society where it says kind of like, let's just take out the abuser completely and start our life over. But unfortunately, if you have children with someone, that's just not how it works. So relearning how to have those boundaries and setting those skills so that your children are able to keep a relationship with their other parent is very important. And it should also be noted that not every time that the abuser is abusive to you, that he's abusive to the child. So it's a huge gray area that has to be explained. And I think there's a lot of myths about how parenting works when you have trauma, you have an abuser, or as a parent, when you identify that child has similar characteristics as a parent.
So a lot of times, and what I see sometimes is that even if the parent that has suffered the trauma continues to go through this trauma, is still not ready to approach and journey through that trauma from a mental health standpoint, their child might. We are growing up with a different generation. Each generation is different. And so with this new generation and this new cohort of kids coming through, they are more open to wanting to talk and wanting to speak. And, I see more youth and more children wanting access to mental health care, even if the parent doesn't support that. And as a survivor and helping these parents to work through that journey and that process, what would you recommend? How would you suggest, even if it's coming from a friend or, an outside person or someone that may see this, to support that child's mental health journey? Because as you said, the trauma or the abuse may not have been to the child, or it may have just been to whatever it was, that child went through it and saw it, and they're ready to journey through that and deal with that trauma. And how do you suggest or support parents in supporting their kids to that mental health aspect?
As a survivor, so for us, it was, I'd like to say I have like perfect kids because they're very supportive of me. I'm very supportive of them. And we talk and we just sit down and say, hey, what is it that we need? Where are we going with this family? What are we going to do? What does that look like? And so for us, as a family, the babies were babies, newborns when the trauma occurred. But my kid, who is now a teenager, like lived through it all. And so I kind of just took her lead. If she said, hey, mom, I want to go to a counselor, like I just told her the pros and cons from my experience. And then I said, hey, but here's some other people that you can talk to who totally don't see it my way, and she did a little bit of therapy, and then she felt like she got kind of bored with it, that it maybe wasn't working for her, or she wasn't getting from it what she thought she would. So we kind of shopped therapists for like 8 months. And then after a while, she just kind of got bored with it and was like, Mom, I don't really think this is bothering me as much anymore. And I think it was just a time that she needed to acknowledge what was going on and deal with what was present and move through it. And so that's what we did. And again, I think for every child and for every parent and for every family, it's different. But I would definitely recommend, as a family, figure it out. Don't just say, I'm mom, I'm right, let's do this, listen to the kids, especially if they can recall or remember, anything that happened.
I think I would say, kind of like JaQuala said, listening to your child and what they need. And you're right when you say we are, this generation of youth are very open about their mental health, very expressive of their feelings. Because today more than ever, I mean, I have second and third graders parents saying, well, she told me that she wanted therapy, because they need that outlet. And so just providing that outlet, whatever it is, whether it's therapy, whether it's arts and crafts, whether it's a journaling, whatever it is, providing outlets, for children to kind of express themselves and to get those emotions out. And if it's therapy, certainly. And then I also say, being included on some of those sessions, go and join your child, on some of those sessions, and and make it a family thing, because we know that the family is only as well as the head is, and so everybody being involved there and things like that to kind of heal the whole family, as a unit, I think is a good and necessary thing when we're talking about the healing process.
From a parent, I'm still going from the parenting coach standpoint. I agree with both JaQuala and Cherie. I would just add that as the survivor of domestic violence, you want to be mindful of your personal emotions and experiences and try not to project them onto your children. One of the things that I've learned over the last 12 years is a lot of times survivors have a difficult time separating how they feel about the abuser despite the relationship between the abuser and the child. So you have to be mindful of that, and also remember that you're not the only victim. I know that that's a very hard thing to say, but you have to say that whether your child was a baby or it was a teenager, it doesn't really matter, because at some point, even just the separation of those two parents makes them have a traumatic experience themselves. So you have to be mindful when you're projecting things on your children. So as a survivor, or even just as a parent, you have to learn how to be a neutral, and it's hard to be a neutral person in those situations, especially if it's a teenager or a small kid that don't quite remember the things that happened within the home. But somebody has to be the bigger adult. And so sometimes you have to separate you from being parent, because your kids see you as a superhero. They don't see you as the survivor of domestic violence. A lot of times, most children don't really care what happened to you. They want to know how you're going to make them feel better. So as a parent, you have to make sure you keep your individuality and make sure you keep your mental health intact, but also be looking at what's in the best interest of your children.
So Jessica said that I think a huge part of parenting, of getting parents on board, is making healthcare accessible. A busy mom might not be able to stomach the thought of yet another appointment during the week, but things like therapy at home or school can help set it up to make a big difference. And yes, I agree that adds on to some of that stress, and maybe even some of that additional trauma that a parent might go to, is having to add another appointment, and just and maybe even something that might be triggering. So I agree. So the next question: what are some of the normal challenges of parenting that may affect survivors in a unique way?
Co-parenting.
That's a good one. Because at some point, both the older your children get, they like both of you at different periods of their lives. So co-parenting is a big one, but I also think we all forget about adolescence. Adolescents, children are hormonal anyway, and they're mean. They're like the mean girl in the crowd. So when you're dealing with trauma or an unhealthy relationship where you have to co-parent, one of the things that you really have to focus on is their development. And you might have two teenagers in the same house that are a year apart or 2 years apart, but they're both, their insight on whatever the experiences were when those two parents were together, or that relationship was going on and that trauma was occurring, may be completely different. So one may lash out and one may shut down. One may be an overachiever, one may not. So you have to really be mindful and not think it's a cookie cutter approach when you're trying to parent two children, because you may have to work with them in different ways.
I think some of the normal challenges of parenting that can, you know, affect survivors in a unique way is just providing emotional and mental health support to your child while you're trying to attend to your own needs as well. And so I think that provides a big challenge, and, you know, addressing those mental health needs and things like that, you know, is a challenge. And so making sure that parents are making themselves a priority and their mental health a priority, as well as, you know, helping, you know, develop, you know, that social emotional, you know, intelligence in their children at the same time, I think is, you know, definitely a normal, you know, social and emotional development. I was reading something the other day. They said that adolescence is like a normal, it's like they called it psychosis. And I kind of thought that was funny. But it is true to, you know, to a very real extent. And so, you know, so that's already a challenge, you know, just for the average parent. But for the parent who has experienced trauma, I think it, you know, it brings on, you know, more challenges.
I'm going to go back to Cherie. I know that they have a lot of programs, and one of the things that they're not really addressing in a lot of those programs that are out in the community is making sure you understand your rights as a parent. I've found that a lot of victims of violence and a lot of abusers are unclear on the boundaries for parenting. So when you don't understand what your rights are as a parent, it kind of creates that hazy area on how to address like gender issues, how to dismiss fathers. Because again, like I said, our culture generally in America is, if there's a domestic violence situation, we're just supposed to cut that individual out, not realizing that that individual is still a part of the family. So how do we make it so that we're not projecting our fears onto the child? So you have to be mindful of those things.
I just wanted to add that when I think of some of the normal challenges of parenting that affect survivors specifically in a unique way, is taking care of yourself. For me, I just go. And I coach every team, and I serve in the community, and everything that my children have, I overcompensate is what it is. But I go. And I make sure that because of the trauma that I have experienced as a child, and the trauma that I've experienced in my past marriage, I make sure that my children absolutely want for nothing. And that means if I have to have 2 hours of sleep and my kids get up and they don't want to eat peanut butter and jelly, they want to have ice cream, I will sacrifice my rest and go get what they want, right? And so I think that some of the normal challenges that are really, really prominent in people who aren't really processing their trauma that well, and it took me a while to understand that, is that we get so used to just carrying that we don't process it or deal with it. It just becomes, I'm used to walking around with brain fog. And you can be very efficient with brain fog, but it's not healthy. It's, you know, you get used to taking care of everybody else except for you. And you kind of accept that I'm just this person who has to carry this around. And maybe one day I won't have to carry it around, but right now I don't have time to process it. For me, that's one of the biggest things that I see with myself and with other survivors, is just that, you know, that self-care. You know, self-care is not sending the children with your mom while you clean the house. Self-care is not, you know, going to wash the car. Self-care is, you know, really, really taking that time and saying, what is it that I need, especially from a mental health standpoint? Do I just need a break? Do I want to just read a book? Do I need to just take a nap? Do I need to take a walk? What kind of mental respite can I be provided that really helps me, you know? And I think a lot of times survivors, we just, you know, we're so used to just moving through it, we don't take care of ourselves.
So one of the points that Brea brought up a couple of times was co-parenting with your abuser. And I really want to continue that piece of the conversation, because that's not a conversation a lot of us are used to hearing, and it's not a conversation or even a process that a lot of survivors are used to going through. And I think that having that discussion really kind of answers or brings to point some of the points that Ajamar brought up too. In your experience, Brea, as coming from a life coach perspective, what have you seen? What barriers have you seen? Or even what are some strengths that you have seen with survivors attempting or even successfully co-parenting with their abuser?
I will say this last year with Life Changes Resource Center has been very interesting to me when we're talking about domestic violence and survivors. I think there are way more African American and Latino men that are victims of domestic violence than what is being shown. I also discovered that a lot of the men that are victims and the women that are victims, a lot of it stems from everybody wants to be a good parent. So therefore, making sure you establish boundaries when you guys are on good terms, so that when you're on bad terms, it's easier to identify. I know over the last year, getting a lot of parents to do a lot of the co-parenting and establishing a custody plan before it gets to that point has been one thing that I don't think men or women really understand. Understanding that both parents have equal rights to the child until there is actually a court order in hand creates a lot of trauma for both parents. So co-parenting is one of the biggest things. And then I also found that a lot of people don't, again, we go back to that saying we don't want people to know what's going on in our house. So they don't want to involve the community. They don't want to involve someone else when it comes to exchanging the child or doing phone conversations or even doing it in writing, because that means someone else may know what's going on behind these closed doors. But whatever it is to safeguard your mental health, because the one thing that I encourage the parents that I work with is to make sure you can identify your trauma. I call them your trauma person. Once you realize that you're a survivor from violence, you have certain fight or flight reactions that are going to always occur. And because those things are going to occur, you need to identify certain behaviors or certain things that trigger those and make sure that those behaviors are not being projected in your co-parenting experiences, because there's certain things that could be said to you by your ex-significant other that will totally send you a different way. Being mindful of those things helps. And I think that continuing to advocate for a clear plan from when we love each other versus when we don't anymore helps bring down some of the domestic violence incidences, but also understanding that mental health is not just a female thing. It's not just a male thing. Mental health can also be maintenance. I think that one of the things that we learned with we didn't learn in the African American community with co-parenting is that sometimes I call them I tell my dads they're tune-up and oil changes. It's okay to get a tune-up and oil change because you're sad. You may have lost a family member, lost a good job, but you have to learn how to engage in the process of dealing with your individual needs to be able to co-parent healthy. Because if you can't, then you get caught up in the wrong thing.
I agree with what Brea is saying 100%, especially with the boundaries. As a survivor, what has helped me the most with co-parenting is your abuser doesn't necessarily want to establish boundaries. So that the next thing I would say runs hand in hand with that is self-advocacy. You have to be able to, first of all, deal with yourself, process whatever's going on in you, but then also set those boundaries, I would say, through the courts and have an understanding in the courts that just because you were a victim of domestic violence, the courts do not necessarily give you any special treatment. You're going to stand in court next to the person who probably tried to run you over, whatever abuse that you endured. You're going to have to deal with that person. And if you don't have a bailiff or a judge that's sensitive to that will at least provide a sheriff there, you have to kind of just take it on the chin. And so there are a lot of opportunities to help educate yourself. I know the law libraries are open to anybody, but I myself had to just really educate myself on what are my rights, what are his rights? But also keep in mind what is best for the children, you know, and how do we make that happen? But really sticking to those boundaries and also submitting that in the form of a parenting plan to the courts as soon as possible is always good, because, you know, that's the sooner you have something solid, then you can start to kind of rebuild and continue the relationship with the children and both parents.
Mhm. And I think that, you know, adding mental health therapy to that, a weekly hour appointment to go into a safe place, you know, to talk about things, to share things, to get different perspective, and just another layer of support, I think is, you know, is a big deal, because like I said, the kids are as well as we are. So when we're well, you know, we can, you know, the greater chance of that the kids are well. And so, you know, adding that support of, like Brea said, a tune up or oil change, you know, however we want to look at it, you know, adding that extra layer of support, you know, with somebody that you can confide into. You can come in, shut that door, and, you know, how I like to describe it is begin to unpack, begin to unload this heavy baggage that we've been carrying around, you know what I'm saying? And going through that process, we're constantly adding more things in this bag. We're adding more stressors, more burdens, more worries. And so having the opportunity to, you know, unload some of that is, you know, really, really, really makes a big difference in everything, I believe. Firm believer in therapy, of course.
Can I piggyback on that? Unloading that does not necessarily mean just grabbing anyone too, because you want someone that also is healthy. So when you're unloading that baggage, that they do understand that they can be a neutral party to say, hey, maybe you're going to the extreme or you're projecting your feelings onto your child. Because a lot of children, and back to what Mr. Binden said, a lot of males shy away from considering themselves a survivor or an abuser solely because of being around toxic parenting their whole life. Mm-hmm. So you have to have people around you that are healthy enough and love you enough to be able to say, hey, you may be going to the extreme, or maybe we need to have some type of formal or informal supports in place until we can get our emotions under control. Because somebody, when you're parenting through trauma, has to be in control. And I'm gonna tell you the truth, it won't be the teenagers. So I suggest, you know, finding somebody that's gonna be neutral for both individuals.
Well, JaQuala, Cherie, and Brea, thank you so much for this. This was a really great discussion and a great beginning of continued discussions. And I really like the new, viewpoints on the parenting with the trauma, the different points, the different types of trauma that you can parent through. So I would now like to open this up to a large group discussion. Yep, if you want to raise your hand, go ahead and do that. If you want to enter your question into the chat, and we can kind of go from there. Jessica, I think nope, that wasn't your hand. So does anyone have any questions that they like? Let's start off with this one, and we can open this up for a large group discussion. What are some specific parenting skills that can help parents who are survivors cope more effectively?
It's not necessarily well, I guess it's a coping mechanism, not a skill for me. I know one of the things that a lot of the parents that I've worked with struggle with finding characteristics of their abuser in their children. So when they view their children in a negative light, it's very hard to parent them fairly. So one of the things that I work on with parent coaching is finding one positive trait. And for me, I use songs. Finding a song I really like that reminds me of my child. So then if something negative from that past experience presents itself from that child, I can still associate some positive things with my child. You have to really project just as many negative emotions as you have positive emotions to be able to keep a level head. So I use songs, and I encourage people to find a song that reminds you of your child, that makes you feel good about being a parent to that child, as one of my coping skills.
Some things that I had jotted down was knowing your limitations, in recognizing, what your parental abilities are. Everybody isn't perfect, and so really maximizing, those abilities, and then being committed to work on the things that we need to change and the things that make us a better parent, and then, and Bree talked about it earlier, and that's setting boundaries. I think boundaries is a big deal, that definitely, I think, is one way that can help, parents, who are experiencing trauma, parent and cope more effectively, is setting those boundaries, and knowing, and making them aware, those kids aware of those boundaries, and just so, it's all respected, because, once boundaries are crossed, things get muddled, and, all sorts of things then happen. But, when we have clear boundaries, communication boundaries, physical boundaries, boundaries of, hey, I need a little break, I need some time, just kind of knowing those boundaries, I think, is a big deal as well.
I would add on to that, safe place.
Mhm.
One of the things that when I've been working with parents on parenting plans is, you got to have a safe place when you post, especially domestic violence relationships and you're co-parenting. You need to have a place where both of you can feel safe exchanging the child, because there is a certain level of trust that has to be rebuilt, but you still have to parent this child, and both parents have a right to that child. So it's important to make sure that as a parent, you have a safe place, a safe person, so that if you feel uncomfortable with certain things, you're able to refer back to this place to make sure that you don't regress back to that space where you were either the victim or you were in that fight or flight mode, because then that's when you start making unhealthy decisions and choices about how to parent your children.
So in the chat, Jessica said that this is so true. My daughter was in the hospital for months this summer. I felt like stressors were maxed out when I suddenly had to see her father every day in the hospital and co-parent with him so much more. I had to figure out how to stifle that fight or flight urge to run. I really had to find new ways to manage my own mental health while being positive for my kids. Sometimes getting extended family to respect boundaries and privacy is hard, and I still struggle with that. And I think that is an additional piece to trying to parent with your abuser, co-parent with your abuser, even if you're parenting by yourself. Setting those boundaries with extended family members also, because that can be triggering. If you went through something, whether it was whatever the type of violence or trauma that you went through, and you have extended family that is aware or knows, not being able to have them respect those boundaries that you have set can be triggering. And that can be an additional piece that makes that parenting and really trying to get through that healing journey even more difficult. So JaQuala, I had a question for you specifically. When you had to start, what was the beginning of that process like for you when you had to start co-parenting? When did you feel safe enough to do that? What did it look like? And just what was that journey and that process like for you?
So it's really easy for me because he is not very consistent. So I hardly have to worry about him. And when he randomly feels like being bothered, he'll call and say, hey, I want to see my kids for an hour, 2 hours like today. So I'm a very agreeable individual. So I'm like, okay, sure, whatever. So I educated myself on policies and what my rights were, what his rights are. We currently have an open case, and it's pretty much, the parenting plan is done, and he'll just continue to oppose it, but he has yet to submit a parenting plan. And a lot of experience with an abuser is just control. And so once you figure out what drives them and you don't feed that, for me, I don't mean to be very nonchalant about it, but it's, I can say it hasn't been as difficult as I imagined it be, because he's not very consistent at all. So it's, I hardly have to see him or deal with him or hear from him. I do worry about my kids because, now that they have established a relationship with him, now it's like, mommy, why can't we go? mommy, let's call daddy. Mommy, I want to call daddy every day. So now the burden kind of lies on me to initiate when he doesn't. So that's kind of a new can of worms. But as far as my PTSD diagnosis and any triggers that I might experience, I really don't at all. A boundary that we set was meeting at the police station. So we meet at the police station. We can't meet anywhere else. I don't budge. If he is acting out or I feel unsafe, it is my constitutional right, according to the state of Nebraska, that I do not have to put myself in any harm's way. I can call the police for an escort, or I just don't have to show up. That has happened a few times, unfortunately. And, for the most part, like I said, I've kind of lucked out. He's not very consistent, so I don't really have to worry about that. But I mean, that's how it's going for me. I thought it would be a lot harder, but it's going.
I think that that's one of the things that when writing parenting plans for parents, that one's always a hard one, and explaining that when you worry about your children being with their abuser, that there is a such thing as a non-emergency number for child welfare checks. Understand that you can still check on your child without having to physically go. And police station exchanges are probably the safest and the most neutral you can get. I know people like exchanging at Walmart. People don't like dealing with the police or whatever, but you would be amazed at how many calls are stopped, CPS calls or police calls or allegations are stopped by just doing an exchange in the police station parking lot. It makes you safer. There's cameras there, and then those people are going to think twice about how they handle you while you're there. Also, things that I've learned that work well is communication, written communication. Some people can't talk for a long time. They can't have conversations. There's certain words, there's certain actions or movements that raise anxiety. So using written communication also helps with creating a healthy dialogue between you and the child. That way the child may know they may know that when dad speaks in this tone, that he's angry, or mom's angry at this tone. So if you're using a notebook, they are kind of taken out of whatever the dialogue is between you and them. And then maybe setting boundaries. We're only going to talk about the kids, or we're only going to talk about the school day on this day. You can only call until this time. I do believe that setting those boundaries on how the parenting plan goes, talking to the kids, discussing what needs to happen with the kids, really has to be set in stone on doing that. And it eliminates, it kind of lessens the control from the abuser. And it also gives the victim a chance to have some control, but able to stabilize what goes on around them.
So if you feel comfortable, so this is from the chat, if you feel comfortable sharing, to what extent, if at all, do you share about your trauma with your child and children? What factors influence your decision? So, and that was something I was going to bring up and ask too. What does that look like?
I'll start with that initially. You can do the mental health piece. From a parent coach perspective, I always tell parents that we have to make sure we remain biased, and you give information based on the age appropriate level. I find that parents put kids in the middle too often because they're emotionally still upset or angry at certain things that happen. So sometimes you have to be the bigger person. So if a child is 4 and they don't necessarily remember the physical altercation, I don't think it's appropriate to share that information with them because they just see their dad as their dad. So you have to really look at what is age appropriate. If it's a 15-year-old and they're still blaming you for the separation and you're still struggling within the home, then maybe it's time to go into the therapist and have that conversation about why we're not together. But you have to make sure that it's in the context to where it's neutral and that they can hear both sides of the story without you putting your emotions involved.
Yeah, I would just have to agree with Brea. I think doing it in a neutral environment, in a neutral therapeutic environment, is a really good way to kind of talk about that, a safe place to talk about that. And not saying that that's where that conversation will end, but it's a good place to, to start that conversation for sure.
So I have a question on top of that, Cherie. So if you're going, if you decide and when you decide to take it to a therapeutic environment, do you have a completely new therapist provide that transition or that conversation? Do you use the child's therapist, the mother's therapist, the father's therapist, or how do you go about choosing how someone will help facilitate that?
I think either the mom's therapist or the child's therapist, and probably if it's a situation where everybody got their own therapist, a lot of times, maybe the fathers aren't participating in therapy, or but maybe the mom joining that child in that therapy session to kind of talk about that trauma history, I think would probably be a good thing. But for me, I see a lot of families. And so I see, a lot of times I start out seeing children, and then parents then will express their need for mental health. And so, so a lot of times for me, I'm working with the entire family. So it would just kind of take place on something like that.
As a survivor and a person who works with survivors, for my teenager, I pretty much just let her say, how it made her feel. For the most part, it doesn't come up anymore because it was years ago, she's gone to counseling. And if there's ever a time where she needs to talk about it, she's unafraid, she just talks about it. For my kids, the little kids, they're 3 and 4, not gonna lie, I lie. If they want to know, like, why are we not seeing daddy today? Going back to age appropriate, I'm just like, oh, daddy's at work, daddy's asleep. Or, I'm not going to say, oh, mommy and daddy are having a disagreement right now. It's, it's age appropriate. I just, I lie. So, but when they're old enough, they'll realize that daddy has not been sleeping for weeks at a time. There'll be a time to tell them, but, at that time, it's, I think a major thing is to not make it bigger than what it is. The processing trauma is sometimes, some people like to say 1 day at a time, but as a survivor, I like to say that it's 1 second at a time, and to understand that it's like really having to experience not being able to breathe for seconds to minutes at a time, and then actually noticing that you haven't taken a breath for seconds or minutes at a time. So, if it's something that's as easy as just telling your 3 or 4-year-old daddy went to sleep, and that's why mommy and daddy are not going to meet today at the nice little place so you can go with daddy, I'm all for it.
One of the things so when my oldest, I have 3, and my oldest is 18. My middle child is 13. And when they were younger, their father was in prison for quite some time. And so I didn't tell them that. I think the oldest one maybe knew, but to kind of help them go through that because they missed him, I would buy them birthday gifts. I would buy them presents. And this was their trauma that they went through. And I would say, oh, this is from your father. And, I created this, this perfect father in their eyes because he still got them gifts. And even though he wasn't there, he thought about them. And by the time he got home, he was not involved at all. And so I had to go back and kind of fix what I created, because I created this person and this father that was involved, this father that was present, and this father that wanted to be with them and wanted to come home to be with them. And when he got home, he wasn't there. And so it was constantly trying to beg the kids, begging and pleading, me begging, be involved and be present with your kids. And so now that he's not, and they see that, I wish I wouldn't have created that. And I wish I would have been a little bit more, even though it may not have been telling them everything, but just being a little more honest about things that they had questions about, because now it's like, well, geez, he got me this stuff all this time, and it was like this. Why now that he's here, is it different? And I say that to lead in kind of to what Ajamal, yes, he created he made his own decisions and he did that, but I feel like a lot of these institutions do create and create some of this trauma. When our men or women become institutionalized, the program, there's not rehabilitation programs. They say that there are, but they're really not. And so we get into this system, and even with, education, the foster care system, the child welfare system, the juvenile justice system, there are so many institutions that create this trauma. And it just adds on to it, because then it becomes a, it adds on to that mental health piece, men and even women not wanting to admit that they have mental health issues or mental health concerns that they need to get addressed.
I agree with you, Jamise. One of the things when I'm not necessarily a domestic violence survivor, but one of the things that I learned when I originally separated from my husband was I cannot nurture a relationship between my children and my ex-husband. So being able to be healthy enough to understand that you can't, I want to say, handle the relationship, you kind of have to let the children go through that normal grief process as well, and let that parent come in or not come in, so that the children can make a decision on their own. I found that a lot of the parents seem to struggle with wanting to tell a child what their dad is or what their mom is, and not letting them figure it out on their own. I remember my mom was a domestic violence survivor, and I don't know how she did it, but she did. When her and my father separated, just her going through the motions with me, letting me cry because he separated himself from the family for a substantial amount of years and not saying anything bad. As parents, we want to fix our children's hurt. So we want to do whatever we can to lessen the blow, but that does not stop the blow from coming. It just prolongs it, and it might make it worse. So you have to do everything at an age appropriate level. And even if you're angry and you have to go to your therapist or your best friend and vent after you deal with that lack thereof of that person, you still have to be there for the child without giving them false hope. So you don't have to necessarily say, well, your dad's never coming, but necessarily say, well, maybe he's busy, I don't know, but keep it an open-ended answer. So therefore you're not the villain for saying something bad about the other parent, but you're also not enabling a relationship that really isn't there.
I so agree with that, Brea. And I think another place where I see this is the foster care system, where I'm working with parents, foster parents and biological parents, and you just see this division between the two, and you see a lot of trauma on both sides, and helping them air their feelings in a appropriate place, and having them learn, hey, you might be going through grief. As a foster parent, when you lose your child, it's a happy time because they're reunifying with their parents, but it might be grief for you. And I think it's really hard to help both sides of that see exactly what to do.
Survivors of trauma have to be mindful and always self-aware of themselves and where they're at emotionally, mentally, physically, financially. If Jamise is buying presents, could you send me some, by the way, Jamise? But seriously, because if you're not centered in where you are, no matter what the trauma is, you're going to keep re-traumatizing yourself, and you're going to react way more extreme than you were if you already knew what was coming.
Amen. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. If our panel can go through and kind of reintroduce themselves, just kind of say your name, what you do. Karen is going to send out, well, there it is, the evaluation link, what you do, what your background is, so that, and if there's any contact information that you would like to have, please put that in the chat.
I was just saying that I'm a licensed independent mental health therapist. I'm a private contractor. I don't work for an agency right now. And I work with all age groups and families and youth, throughout the community. So that's what I do.
My name is Brea. I am a community advocate that has worked with Black and Brown families for the last, I don't want to age myself, for a number of years. The reason why Life Changes Resource Center was founded was because there was a lot of barriers that hindered Black and Brown communities from progressing in areas of trauma, education, and understanding the connection. So one of the things that Life Changes focuses on is the systemic trauma and racism the lack of appropriate social relations between people of color, and the lack of education and supports and understanding the cultural needs when it relates to families of trauma and families of color. So for me, I just found the 3 areas over the 12 years that I focused on most to make families successful. And those are the areas that Lyfe Changes works with families. So it could be domestic violence, it could be anything. Mental health is a big one, yes. Domestic violence is a big one as well. But learning what things hurt them, and what can we do to empower others to do better.
My name is JaQuala Yarbro. I am a founder of a tech startup called Compete Technologies, and also a nonprofit called Compete, Institute of Socioeconomic Policy and Education. And what we do, it's really all the same work, is we basically bridge the gaps that Black people particularly experience when they're dealing with the child welfare system. We kind of broker relationships and gather data. I have a background in data science. And so we use data and trauma-informed policies that are used in our sister cities or places similar to what we experience in this area. And we create models, and we partner with agencies such as DHHS, Project Harmony, CSI, Nebraska's Children, just to really help them become a little bit more cultural competent in their practices.
So we also have Candy Jones on this call right now. She is the president, the board president of Survivors Rising. Candy, would you like to say a few words?
This has been incredible. Thank you all so much for joining us and spending time with us this evening. What an amazing opportunity to connect and learn from all of you. And I heard some things that I feel like we need to continue around co-parenting through trauma and what the mental health profession looks like when you're navigating kind of Black and brown people. So I would love to invite you all back to come and share with us some more about your areas of expertise and experience. I think it was amazing. So again, thank you so much, Jamise. Excellent job facilitating. We really appreciate it. Please remember to fill out your evaluation. That does help us to ensure that the programming we provide to all of you is what you're looking for and what you need to ensure you have healthy relationships and that you can, navigate your own experiences better. That's our goal, right? To lift you all up as we lift each other. So again, thank you all for this amazing panel. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Jamise, for facilitating.
Thank you. Yeah. Again, thank you, Brea. Thank you, JaQuala, and thank you, Cherie. We really appreciate your time and your expertise.
Well, thanks again for coming. This was a great evening, a great event.
Yes. Y'all have a good evening. Thank you.